To anyone else, the corroded shell of the 1968 school bus was a monument to failure, a final, rusting tombstone on a life that had flatlined. For Elias Thorne, a man whose shoulders carried the invisible weight of a flag-draped coffin, it was simply the end of the line, a place to dissolve into the fog of memory and cheap whiskey. Every night, the ghosts of Kandahar whispered through the broken window seals, their voices mingling with the phantom scent of his wife's perfume. A cruel cocktail of grief that left him hollowed out and waiting for nothing. But his German shepherd, Shadow, a creature of silent wisdom and unwavering loyalty, knew better. He knew that inside the rust and ruin, beneath the floorboards that had held the laughter of children decades ago, lay a $200 million secret that could get his master killed. A secret the dog was determined to unearth, one insistent nudge at a time. This story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the deepest wounds are healed by the quietest love. We are a small team, and your support helps us continue to bring these stories to life. If you feel a connection to this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel. And we'd love to know who we're sharing this with. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. The cold was a physical presence inside the bus. It seeped up from the metal floor, a malevolent dampness that clung to Elias's bones and refused to let go. He sat on an overturned milk crate, the bottle in his hand half empty, its contents doing little to warm him. Outside, the Oregon rain fell in a steady, percussive rhythm against the curved roof, a somber drumbeat for a life in stasis. Shadow lay at his feet, his massive head resting on Elias's worn combat boot. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on him, not with judgment, but with a profound, knowing patience that was almost unbearable. Elias took another long pull from the bottle, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the ache in his chest. It had been 2 years since he'd buried Lena, 2 years since the world had lost its color, its sound, its meaning. The official report called it a tragic hit and run, a case gone cold. To Elias, it was the precise moment the universe had tilted off its axis, leaving him stranded in the wreckage. He'd lost the house first, swallowed by medical bills and the suffocating emptiness of rooms that echoed with her absence. Then the job, his focus shattered, his discipline eroded by a grief so vast it had its own gravity. His family, his sister and her husband had tried to help. They'd offered him their spare room, their pity, their well-meaning but useless advice. He couldn't stand the looks in their eyes, the careful way they spoke to him as if he were a piece of fragile glass. So he'd taken the last of his money, bought this forgotten plot of land with the derelict bus rotting in its center, and disappeared. He'd wanted only to be left alone with his ghosts. Shadow was the one variable he hadn't accounted for. The dog, Lena's dog, was a living, breathing link to the life he'd lost, and a stubborn refusal to let him completely surrender. As Elias raised the bottle again, a low growl rumbled in Shadow's chest. It wasn't aggressive, but it was definitive. The dog shifted his weight, nudging the bottle with his snout, a gentle but firm command. "Knock it off, boy," Elias mumbled, his words slurring slightly. He tried to push the dog's head away, but Shadow was insistent. He stood up, a fluid motion of muscle and black fur, and placed a heavy paw on Elias's arm, pushing it down. Then, he whined softly and nudged Elias's other hand, the one not holding the bottle, before trotting to a specific spot near the driver's seat. He pawed at a section of the warped plywood floor, then looked back at Elias, his tail giving a single, expectant thump. "There's nothing there, Shadow. Just rot," but the dog didn't move. He whined again, a more urgent sound this time, and pawed at the same spot, his claws making a scratching sound against the decaying wood. The sheer, stubborn intelligence in the dog's gaze cut through the alcoholic haze. For the first time in months, a flicker of something other than despair sparked within Elias. Annoyance, maybe. Curiosity. It was enough. With a groan, he heaved himself off the crate, the movement sending a protest through his stiff joints. He set the bottle down, the glass clinking against the metal floor. Shadow's tail thumped again, harder this time. This was his first mission. An order from his most loyal soldier. The next morning, sobriety returned with a throbbing headache and a wave of self-loathing. The half-empty bottle stood on the floor like an accuser. But beside it was a crowbar he'd salvaged from an old tool chest, and the memory of Shadow's strange insistence. Elias looked at the dog, who was watching him with that same unnerving focus. "All right, you win," he sighed, his voice raspy. He picked up the crowbar and walked to the spot Shadow had indicated. The plywood was soft with damp, splintering easily as he forced the tip of the crowbar beneath it. With a groan of protesting wood and a screech of rusted nails, a section of the floor came loose. Elias tossed it aside, revealing the grimy, corrugated metal chassis beneath. Nothing. See? Nothing, but Shadow wasn't looking at the empty space. He was sniffing intently at the wall of the bus, just beside the wheel well, where a piece of metal paneling had buckled inward. He nudged it with his nose, then looked back at Elias. This was more than just a dog's whim. This was deliberate. Elias ran his calloused fingers over the panel. It felt different from the rest of the bus's interior skin, thicker, colder. He tapped it with the crowbar. The sound wasn't the hollow clang of the other panels. It was a dull, solid thud. A false wall. His heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. Using the crowbar, he found the edge of the panel and began to pry. It was slow, difficult work. The screws were fused with rust, the metal bent and stubborn. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the damp chill of the air. This was work. This was effort. This was focus. For a full hour, he forgot about the bottle, about the ghosts, about the crushing weight on his soul. There was only the tool in his hand, the resistance of the metal, and the quiet, encouraging presence of his dog. Finally, with a loud shriek of tortured metal, the panel tore free. Behind it, nestled in a small, hollowed-out cavity and wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, heavy steel box. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox, but it was sealed with a formidable-looking combination lock, the kind with 4 intricate dials. Elias stared at it, his breath misting in the cold air. Shadow sat beside him, letting out a soft woof of satisfaction. The dog hadn't just given him a chore, he'd given him a puzzle. He'd given him a purpose, however small. Elias ran a hand over the dog's head, scratching behind his ears. "Okay, boy," he whispered, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Let's see what we've got." The lock on the steel box was a work of art, and a formidable challenge. It wasn't a standard master lock. The dials were unmarked, covered in a series of tiny, hand-etched symbols. Gears, leaves, stars, and waves. It was a custom job, designed by someone who thought in patterns, not numbers. For the first time in years, Elias felt the dormant parts of his mind stir. This was a problem that couldn't be solved with brute force. It required the patience and analytical skill he'd honed in special forces, skills he thought he'd buried for good. He carried the box to the small, rickety table he'd fashioned from salvaged lumber and set it down. For 2 days, the box became his world. He didn't drink. He barely ate. He sat for hours, a magnifying glass in one hand, a small notebook in the other, sketching the symbols, trying to decipher their logic. The process was meditative. It was a return to a version of himself he thought was long dead, the man who could disassemble and reassemble a rifle blindfolded, who could read a landscape for threats, who could find order in chaos. He noticed that the symbols were grouped. The gears were all on the first dial, the leaves on the second, and so on. It was a sequence. But what was the key? He searched the bus, every nook and cranny, looking for a clue the original owner might have left. He found nothing but more rust and decay. Defeated, he slumped back at his table, staring at the box. Shadow, sensing his frustration, rested his head on Elias's knee. Elias absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur, his eyes scanning the interior of the bus. And then he saw it, scratched almost invisibly into the dusty glass of the driver's side window, likely with a diamond ring or a carbide tip, was a phrase, "Where the forest meets the factory, the river meets the sky." It was a riddle. Elias's mind raced. Forest, leaves. Factory, gears. River, waves. Sky, stars. It was the order, the sequence for the dials. His hands trembled slightly as he began to turn the dials. He found the most intricate gear symbol for factory, the oldest-looking oak leaf for forest, the most turbulent wave for river, and the brightest-looking star for sky. He aligned them, took a deep breath, and pulled the latch. It didn't budge. He felt a surge of frustration. It had seemed so perfect. He slumped, ready to give up, to reach for the bottle. But then he looked closer at the riddle. It wasn't factory then forest. It was where the forest meets the factory. It was the intersection. He had to find the symbol on each dial that blended the two themes. On the first dial, there was a single symbol of a gear wrapped in a vine. On the second, a leaf with a serrated, mechanical edge. On the third, a wave that crested into a cloud. And on the fourth, a star that looked like the spark from a welder's torch. It was brilliant, a level of complexity that spoke of a deeply clever, careful mind. He realigned the dials to the hybrid symbols. This time, when he pulled the latch, it opened with a satisfying, well-oiled click. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were two items. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal. The second was a single, ornately carved wooden key, shaped like a serpent swallowing its own tail. Elias gently lifted the journal. The pages were filled with elegant, looping cursive. It was the diary of a man named Arthur Pembroke, a master craftsman and clockmaker who had lived in the bus for the last 20 years of his life. As Elias read, a story of quiet defiance and profound integrity unfolded. Arthur had been a genius, an inventor who had created a revolutionary new alloy, lightweight, virtually indestructible, with applications in aerospace and technology that were decades ahead of its time. He had been courted by corporations, but refused to sell, fearing his creation would be used for war. One corporation in particular, led by a ruthless young CEO, had been relentless. They had threatened him, tried to steal his research, and harassed him until he retreated from the world, hiding his life's work and living out his days in this bus, protecting his secret. The journal was filled with Arthur's observations, his philosophical musings, and his detailed, coded notes on the formula for the alloy. The final entry was chilling. "The vulture circles still," Arthur had written. "He thinks I am just a crazy old man in a rusty box. He doesn't know I have left my legacy where no one would ever think to look. Not buried in the ground, but in the very thing he scorns. The serpent will guard the garden, the serpent." Elias looked at the wooden key in his hand. This wasn't just about a hidden formula anymore. It was about honoring this man's last wish. Arthur Pembroke had entrusted his legacy to whoever was clever and patient enough to find it. Elias Thorne, the broken soldier, had just been given a new mission. He closed the journal, his hands steady. The ghosts in the bus seemed quieter now, replaced by the determined spirit of a long-dead craftsman. "Okay, Arthur," Elias said to the empty bus. "Let's protect your garden." The mission transformed Elias. The act of restoration became a form of prayer, a way of rebuilding himself as he rebuilt the bus. Arthur's journal became his manual, not just for finding the hidden legacy, but for living. The old craftsman had filled the margins with sketches and notes on woodworking, mechanics, and solar power. He had planned to turn the bus into a self-sufficient masterpiece, a testament to ingenuity. Elias decided to finish the job. He started with the rust. For weeks, he worked with a wire brush and a grinder, stripping away the decay, layer by layer. It was grueling, monotonous work, but with every patch of clean, bare metal he exposed, he felt a corresponding lightness in his own spirit. He was scrubbing away his own inertia, his own decay. Shadow was his constant supervisor, lying in a patch of sun, occasionally bringing him a dropped tool or simply resting a head on his lap during a break. To fund the project, Elias sold the one thing of value he had left from his old life, a vintage watch Lena had given him. It pained him to let it go, but he knew she would have understood. He used the money to buy lumber, wiring, and tools from a small, family-run hardware store in the nearby town. The owner, a grizzled man in his 70s named Gus, had a kind face and hands permanently stained with wood varnish. "Fixin' up the old Pembroke bus, are you?" Gus asked on Elias's third visit, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Elias, wary of conversation, just nodded. Arthur was a good man, a bit of an eccentric, but his heart was in the right place. Glad to see someone's giving that old girl a second chance, Gus never pried. He just offered sound advice on lumber choices and electrical systems, treating Elias not as a charity case or a broken man, but simply as a fellow craftsman. These brief, quiet interactions were anchors to the world, pulling him slowly back into the orbit of human connection. Following Arthur's intricate plans, Elias began to frame the interior. He worked with beautiful reclaimed cedar, the spicy, clean scent filling the bus and chasing away the last of the stale, sorrowful air. He measured twice and cut once, the discipline of his training flowing into his hands. He built a small, efficient kitchen galley, a compact sleeping bunk, and clever storage compartments hidden in the walls and under the floor. He installed solar panels on the roof and wired the bus for light and power. The dull, lifeless shell began to glow from within at night, a warm beacon of progress in the dark woods. He even got the old engine to turn over. After weeks of cleaning parts, replacing hoses, and patiently coaxing it back to life, it roared to life with a plume of black smoke that quickly cleared into a steady, rumbling idle. The sound was a resurrection. Elias leaned against the warm hood, a wide, genuine grin spreading across his face as Shadow barked in triumph. The bus was no longer a tomb. It was becoming a home, a sanctuary built not just of wood and steel, but of purpose. The more he worked, the more he understood Arthur's philosophy. The act of creating, of bringing order from chaos, was its own reward. It was a way of pushing back against the darkness. He hadn't just found Arthur's journal. He had inherited his spirit. One afternoon, while installing a bookshelf, he noticed a small serpent symbol, identical to the one on the wooden key, carved into the back of a floorboard. This was it. The next step. Prying it up, he found a hidden compartment containing not a formula, but a complex clockwork mechanism built into the chassis of the bus itself. In the center of the interlocking gears was a keyhole, a perfect match for the serpent key. This was the garden the serpent guarded. Arthur hadn't hidden his legacy in the bus. The bus was the safe, and Elias was getting very close to opening it. He was sanding the newly installed cedar cabinets, the rhythmic motion a form of meditation, when the sound of an engine, too smooth and quiet to be a local's pickup, broke the forest's silence. A sleek, black sedan, looking utterly alien in the rugged landscape, crunched to a halt on the gravel track leading to his clearing. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Elias put a calming hand on the dog's back, his own senses on high alert. A man in a tailored suit, his shoes impeccably polished despite the muddy surroundings, stepped out of the car. He was handsome, with a practiced, confident smile that didn't quite reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Mr. Thorne?" the man said, his voice as smooth as his suit. "My name is Marcus Vance. I'm a senior partner at Vance Development." Elias said nothing, just stood in the doorway of the bus, his hands still on Shadow's ruff, a silent, formidable barrier. Vance's eyes swept over the bus, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even annoyance, crossing his features as he took in the obvious signs of restoration. The gleaming solar panels, the new windows, the stacks of fresh lumber. "Quite the project you have here," he said, his tone patronizing. "I'll be direct. My company has acquired most of the surrounding land. We're planning a high-end, eco-luxury resort. This little parcel of yours is right in the middle of our prime development zone. It's an eyesore," he paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "But I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. Far more than this land is worth. Enough to get you a proper home, a fresh start." He named a figure that, a year ago, would have been a lifeline Elias would have desperately grabbed. But things were different now. This wasn't just a piece of land. It was a trust. It was Arthur's legacy. It was his own salvation. "Not for sale," Elias said, his voice flat and even. Vance's smile tightened. Mr. Thorne, let's not be sentimental. It's a rusted-out bus on a patch of dirt. I'm offering you $100,000. Cash. Elias thought of Arthur's journal, of the man who had turned down fortunes to protect his principles. The vulture circles still. This was him. This was the man who had harassed a brilliant old inventor into exile. I heard you the first time, Elias said, his voice dropping. The answer is no. Vance's mask of civility slipped. A flicker of raw anger flashed in his eyes before he smoothed it over. Think it over, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket and placing it on a nearby tree stump. I'm a very persistent man. I always get what I want. He got back in his car, and the sedan disappeared down the track, leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and the quiet hum of a threat delivered. Elias looked down at Shadow. Well, boy, he said grimly, looks like the vulture has landed. Vance's persistence was not just a boast. It was a promise. A week after his visit, the harassment began, subtle at first, then escalating with chilling precision. A county inspector, a man with shifty eyes and a clipboard, showed up unannounced, citing a dozen fictitious code violations for the bus and the property. He spoke of condemnation, of fines Elias couldn't possibly pay. Elias, using the calm, methodical logic he'd rediscovered, asked for the inspector's credentials and the specific statutes he was violating. The man stammered, unable to provide details, and left in a huff, but the message was clear. The system could be used against him. A few days later, Elias returned from a supply run into town to find all 4 tires on his old pickup truck slashed. There was no note, no sign of the vandal, just the quiet, malevolent act of sabotage, designed to isolate him, to cut him off from the world he was just beginning to rejoin. The threats became more direct. One morning, he found a dead raven placed carefully on the bus's doorstep, a stark and morbid warning. Shadow went into a frenzy, barking and circling the clearing, his instincts screaming that their sanctuary had been breached. Elias's own training kicked in. The hypervigilance he had tried so hard to suppress now became his shield. He began sleeping in shorter, lighter shifts. He walked the perimeter of his property every sunrise and sunset, checking for tracks, for any sign of disturbance. He was no longer just a man restoring a bus. He was a soldier defending a position. The therapeutic labor of sanding wood and wiring circuits was now augmented with the grim work of securing his home. He reinforced the door and windows not just against the elements but against a human threat. The final straw came late one night. Elias was jolted awake by a bright light sweeping across the interior of the bus. He moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. Vance's black sedan was parked at the edge of the property. Vance himself stood beside it, talking on his phone, his face illuminated by the screen. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. He wanted to be seen. He wanted Elias to know he was being watched, that he was vulnerable. The sheer arrogance of it ignited a cold fire in Elias's gut. This wasn't just a business dispute over a piece of land anymore. It was a psychological war, and Vance was attacking the fragile peace Elias had fought so hard to build. He watched until the car finally pulled away, the red taillights disappearing into the oppressive dark. He sat in the silence, Shadow's warm body pressed against his leg, a reassuring anchor in the rising tide of fear and anger. He knew he couldn't back down. He had to see this through for Arthur and now for himself. But to fight Vance, he had to understand him. He had to know his enemy. The next day, he drove into town on his spare tires and spent hours at the public library, diving into the digital history of Vance development, determined to find a weakness, a piece of leverage, anything he could use to fight back. He had no idea he was about to uncover a truth that would shatter his world all over again. The library's internet was slow, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but Elias was locked in, his focus absolute. He scrolled through years of business articles, press releases, and shareholder reports on Vance development. The company was a predator, known for hostile takeovers and aggressive development projects that often skirted environmental and labor laws. Marcus Vance's name was everywhere, his smiling face plastered over articles praising his vision and ruthless efficiency. Elias was digging for financial vulnerabilities, past lawsuits, anything to give him an edge. He found plenty of smoke, rumors of bribery, sealed settlements with disgruntled partners, but no fire. Then he changed his search terms, focusing on projects from around 2 years ago, the time when Lena was killed. He cross-referenced Vance's construction sites with the area of the hit and run. There was nothing direct. It was a dead end. Frustrated, he was about to log off when he decided on one last, broader search. Marcus Vance Philanthropy. Maybe the man had a public weakness, a charity he exploited for PR. A local news article from a society gala popped up, dated 3 weeks before Lena's death. The headline read, "Vance Development celebrates record profits at Children's Hospital Gala." There was a photo of Vance, champagne flute in hand, smiling his predatory smile. And standing just behind him, schmoozing with another guest, was a man whose face stopped Elias's heart. He zoomed in, his breath catching in his throat. The man was unremarkable, balding, with a weak chin and a cheap suit. But Elias knew him. He was the subject of a police sketch that had been seared into his memory, the one eyewitnesses had vaguely described as fleeing the scene of Lena's accident. At the time, with no other leads, it had faded into the background of the cold case file. But there he was. The man's name, according to the photo caption, was Alistair Finch, a mid-level project manager for one of Vance's subcontractors. The world tilted again, just as it had on the day Lena died. Elias's mind, trained to connect disparate pieces of intelligence, fired in a rapid, sickening cascade. Lena, what was she working on before she died? She was an investigative journalist, and she had been excited, on the verge of breaking a huge story. She'd been secretive about it, for her own safety, but she'd mentioned falsified building inspections and substandard materials in a major downtown development, a Vance development project. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a random hit and run. It was an assassination. Lena had gotten too close, and Vance had her silenced, using a disposable employee to do the dirty work. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache in Elias's chest now morphed into something else entirely. A white-hot, razor-sharp rage. The fight for this land, for Arthur's legacy, was no longer a matter of principle. It was a quest for justice. Vance hadn't just tried to take his home. He had already taken his life. The man who haunted his past was the same man threatening his future. The wound and the stakes had just fused into one. Elias printed the photo, his hands shaking with fury. He walked out of the library not as a grieving husband, but as an instrument of vengeance. The broken veteran was gone. The Special Forces operator was back, and he was going to war. The drive back to the bus was a blur of cold fury. When Elias stepped out of his truck, the world looked different. Every tree was cover, every shadow a potential concealment. The gentle slope of the land was no longer a feature of the landscape. It was a field of fire. His mission had changed, and so had the theater of operations. The bus, his sanctuary of healing, was about to become his fortress. The restoration was over. The fortification had begun. He worked with a chilling, focused efficiency that left no room for grief or fear. His pain was now fuel, channeled into a singular, deadly purpose. He took the skills that had haunted his dreams, the knowledge of traps, demolitions, and tactical defense, and repurposed them. He was no longer running from his past. He was weaponizing it. His first step was surveillance. He used small, motion-activated trail cams, the kind used by hunters, and placed them strategically along the approach to his property, camouflaging them with the precision of a sniper hiding his position. They were all linked to a small tablet he powered with his solar array. He would not be caught by surprise again. Next, he turned the bus itself into a trap. Arthur's ingenious designs, meant for self-sufficiency, were now adapted for defense. The solar-powered electrical system was rewired to a separate circuit that controlled a series of high-intensity LED floodlights he mounted discreetly around the bus. With the flip of a single, hidden switch, he could turn the pitch-black clearing into a blindingly lit stage, ruining an intruder's night vision and exposing them completely. He dug a shallow trench around the bus, hidden under a layer of leaves and forest debris, just deep enough to turn an ankle or trip a man running in the dark. He reinforced the single door with a steel bar he salvaged from an old axle, making it a formidable barricade. Inside, he prepared for the final confrontation he knew was coming. He moved his heavy workbench to block one of the main windows, creating a solid point of cover. He prepositioned his tools, heavy wrenches, a pry bar, a nail gun with its air hose coiled and ready, not as instruments of creation but as improvised weapons. He was turning his home into a meticulously prepared kill zone, designed not to kill, but to disable, disorient, and capture. He would not become a murderer like Vance. He would deliver justice, not vengeance. During the day he practiced. He moved through the terrain, memorizing every route, every rock. He timed how long it would take an intruder to move from the edge of the woods to the bus. He rehearsed his plan over and over until the sequence of actions was pure muscle memory. Shadow watched him, the dog's usual calm demeanor replaced by a tense alertness. He seemed to understand the shift in his master. He no longer dozed in the sun. He patrolled, a silent, four-legged sentinel, his ears constantly twitching, his nose testing the wind. One evening, as Elias reviewed his preparations, he finally turned his attention back to the clockwork mechanism under the floor. He inserted the serpent key. With a series of soft, satisfying clicks, the gears turned, and a hidden drawer slid out from the side of the bus's chassis. Inside, protected in a waterproof case, were Arthur's detailed schematics and the complete written formula for his alloy. But tucked beneath them was something else. A small, black ledger. Elias opened it. Arthur, the quiet observer, had been watching Vance for years. The ledger contained dates, names, and illegal payments, detailing Vance's corruption, including the payoffs for the falsified inspections on the very building Lena had been investigating. It was the proof, the smoking gun. Elias now had everything he needed. He had the motive, the means, and the trap. All he had to do was wait for the vulture to come to him. The storm rolled in just after midnight, a furious assault of wind and driving rain that lashed against the bus. It was the perfect cover for an attack. Elias sat in the darkness, the tablet in his lap, watching the grainy, night vision feeds from his trail cams. Shadow lay at his feet, utterly still, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. He knew they were coming. Just before 2 a.m., the first camera triggered. Two men, dressed in black, carrying heavy flashlights and what looked like crowbars, moved cautiously out of the treeline. A third figure followed, Vance. He wasn't sending his thugs this time. He was coming himself to watch his problem be erased. Elias's heart pounded a steady, cold rhythm against his ribs. The time had come. He let them get closer, let their confidence build as they approached the dark, silent bus. They thought they were predators stalking sleeping prey. He watched them on the screen as they fanned out, one heading for the back, the other two for the front door. The man in the back suddenly vanished from the screen with a muffled cry. He had found the trench. One down. The two at the door, Vance and the remaining thug, paused, their flashlight beams cutting nervously through the rain. What was that? Vance hissed. Probably just slipped. The thug grunted, then turned his attention to the door, inserting his crowbar into the seam. Elias smiled grimly in the dark. That door wasn't going anywhere. As the thug put his full weight against the crowbar, Elias flipped the switch. The world outside the bus exploded in brilliant, blinding white light. The men yelled, throwing their hands up to shield their eyes from the sudden, shocking glare. Disoriented and exposed, they were perfect targets. Elias activated the second part of his plan. A high-frequency audio emitter he'd salvaged from an old pest control device blasted a piercing, ultrasonic shriek from a speaker hidden under the bus. It was agonizing for human ears. The thug dropped his crowbar, clutching his head. Vance stumbled back, his face a mask of pain and confusion. This was the moment. Elias kicked the steel bar away from the door and threw it open, moving with a speed and violence Vance could never have anticipated. He burst out of the bus, a dark shape against the blinding light, and slammed his shoulder into the thug, driving him to the ground. The man went down hard, the air rushing out of his lungs. 2 down. Vance, recovering from the initial shock, fumbled inside his expensive coat and pulled out a small silver pistol. The rain glinted on the barrel. "You're a dead man, Thorne!" he screamed over the piercing sound. Elias didn't hesitate. He dove back inside the bus, slamming the reinforced door shut just as a gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood where his head had been. He scrambled behind the workbench as Vance kicked the door open and stormed in, his eyes wild. Nowhere left to run. Vance snarled, advancing into the bus. Elias had counted on this arrogance. He'd counted on Vance wanting to finish this himself. From his position, Elias grabbed the coiled hose of the nail gun. He fired a burst of nails into the floor in front of Vance, the rapid-fire explosions deafening in the confined space. Vance flinched back, startled, giving Elias the opening he needed. He launched himself over the workbench, tackling Vance around the waist. The 2 men crashed to the floor, the gun skittering away into a dark corner. Vance was strong, fueled by rage and desperation, but Elias was stronger, powered by 2 years of grief and a lifetime of training. They rolled on the floor, trading blows. Elias landed a solid punch to Vance's jaw, but Vance drove a knee into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, Vance got the upper hand. He pinned Elias's shoulders, his hands closing around Elias's throat, his face contorted in a mask of murderous fury. "You should have taken the money," he choked out, squeezing harder. Elias's vision started to swim in black spots. He was losing, but he hadn't been fighting alone. From the shadows of the sleeping bunk where Elias had commanded him to stay, a black blur erupted. Shadow, silent until this exact moment, launched himself through the air. He hit Vance's shoulder with the force of a battering ram, his jaws closing not on flesh, but on the arm that held the gun Vance had just managed to retrieve. The crunch of bone was sickeningly loud. Vance screamed, a sound of pure agony, his grip on Elias's throat vanishing. The gun clattered uselessly to the floor. Shadow didn't let go. He held Vance pinned, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fire, the low growl in his chest the only sound besides the rain and Vance's pathetic whimpering. Elias gasped for air, pushing himself up. He looked at his loyal partner, his hero, and then at the defeated man on the floor. It was over. The flashing lights of the state police cruisers painted the rain-soaked clearing in strobing blues and reds. Elias sat on the steps of the bus, a thick blanket draped over his shoulders, with Shadow pressed firmly against his side. Vance and his 2 battered thugs were being loaded into separate cars. Before the police arrived, Elias had used an anonymous burner phone to make a call, directing them not only to the assault in progress but also to a specific, waterproof package he had left for them at the end of the gravel road. The package contained Arthur's ledger and a printed copy of the photo of Vance and Alistair Finch, along with a detailed note explaining their connection to the cold case of investigative journalist Lena Thorne. He had given them the entire conspiracy, gift-wrapped. Justice would be slow, but it would be absolute. Gus, the hardware store owner, had come with the police. Apparently, he was also a volunteer captain with the local fire department and had heard the call. He walked over to Elias, his face etched with concern. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Elias looked up, not at the old man, but at the bus. It stood against the dawn, scarred from the fight but whole, the warm light from its windows a defiant glow against the gray morning. It was more than a home. It was a monument to survival. "I am now, Gus," Elias said, and the words felt true for the first time in years. "I think I finally am." Weeks later, after the legal storm had passed and Vance's empire began to crumble under the weight of a reopened murder investigation, Elias received a visitor, a lawyer representing a consortium of tech and aerospace companies, who, after being anonymously tipped off about Arthur's alloy, had verified its revolutionary properties. The schematics were worth a fortune. They made Elias an offer that was not just life-changing, but world-changing. He accepted, but not for himself. He used the vast sum of money to establish the Lena Thorne Foundation for Journalistic Integrity, a nonprofit dedicated to funding and protecting investigative journalists who, like Lena, were willing to speak truth to power. His sister and her husband, having heard the incredible story, visited him, their faces a mixture of awe and apology. They saw not the broken man who had run away, but a man who had forged a new life from the ashes of his old one. They saw the bus, no longer a symbol of decay, but a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a beautiful, functional work of art. And they finally understood the profound bond between the quiet man and his magnificent dog. Elias chose to stay. He and Shadow lived in the bus, a perfect, self-sufficient home nestled in the Oregon woods. The ghosts were finally gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and purpose. He had not only restored a bus, he had restored his soul. He had not only found a hidden legacy, he had created one for the woman he loved, ensuring her name and her courage would never be forgotten. Standing in the doorway of his home, with Shadow's head resting on his boot, Elias watched the sunrise paint the sky, finally able to see all the colors again. In the end, this journey was about more than just restoring an old bus. It was about the profound truth that our deepest purpose can often be found in the wreckage of our lives. It's a story that proves that loyalty, in its purest form, whether from a person or a faithful dog, has the power to lead us out of the darkness and remind us of who we were always meant to be. Elias Thorne's hands didn't just rebuild a vehicle. They rebuilt a life, proving that the most resilient structures are built not with steel and wood, but with love and unwavering resolve. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, we would be so grateful if you would like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Every subscription helps our small team continue our work. We'd be honored to read your own stories of healing and loyalty in the comments below. What was the moment you knew you could start rebuilding? Until next time, be well and take care of one another.